Today our webinar is about same game, which we will get into what exactly that is in just a few minutes. But for now, I will leave you in suspense and say that we're going to help you bring your gender equity vision to life, and then we will show you how in just a second. And just before we get started, a couple of kind of housekeeping things. So my name is Greer, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator for Canadian Women in Sport. And I'm here with my colleague Jenny. So I will let Jenny introduce herself just briefly before we move on.
Hi everyone, I'm Jenny Lim, Program Manager at Canadian Women in Sport.
And we also have Erin on the call today, which you heard, who is joining us from Oshawa Kicks. And Erin, I will give you a bit more of an introduction later on, but if you wanted to introduce yourself or mention anything now, then you can definitely do that.
Yeah, just my name is Erin McCauley, and like Greer said, I'm from Oshawa Kicks, which is a local soccer club in Oshawa, and I am the Director of Programs.
Thanks, Erin. So assuming that everyone is pretty comfortable with Zoom by now, and I can see that we're kind of here, and some of us have our video on and some of us don't. So just a reminder to keep your microphone off if you're not speaking. But if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to just turn it on and add those into the discussion. Or you can also raise your hand, and we can see that your hand has been raised, and we can take a bit of a pause to answer any questions that you might have. If you do have questions or comments and you don't want to turn on your mic or raise your hand, you can also use the chat function and let us know there and send a message to everyone. And we will use breakout rooms as well. It seems like maybe if we are staying at around 4 or 5 participants, we can do a group discussion, but if we have more people joining us, then we can jump into breakout rooms as well to have a bit of a discussion. And if you have any technical questions, again, just let us know in the chat, and someone will help you out there. So just before we get started, I want to acknowledge that Jenny and I are joining from a city known as Toronto, and that this is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and also covered by the Dish with One Spoon wampum belt. And in another presentation that we did as a staff, I learned that kind of the significance behind the Dish with One Spoon is that everyone has the one spoon to share resources, and everyone kind of gets what they need. And I think that's something that we can ground our conversation in today, since we are talking about equity and about kind of distributing resources. And we want to just share a little bit about Canadian Women in Sport and what we do before we jump into the presentation. So we are dedicated to creating an equitable Canadian sports system that empowers girls and women to lead and participate. And what we focus on is systemic change. So we want to focus on changing the culture of sport and changing the way that sport is structured and the way that decisions are made, to make sure that the needs and perspectives of women and girls are accounted for at every level. So what we're going to get into today is we're going to talk a little bit more about this thing called the same game model and what it is and why we've developed it. And then we're going to dive a little bit more into one of the steps of the model, which is around the importance of data collection. And then fortunately, we have Erin with us here today, who is going to share a little bit about her experience as one of the pilot partners in developing the model. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion and Q&A at the end.
Meditation room.
But again, if you do have any questions throughout, you can feel free to put them in the chat, and we don't have to necessarily wait to the end to respond. Okay, so what is Same Game? So this is a project that was funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada, and we ran it in partnership with Ontario Soccer and Ontario Basketball, and also a research team from Brock University. And it really started with a survey where we went out to provincial sport organizations in the province of Ontario, and we asked them about their experiences implementing gender equity initiatives. And what we found was that there was this big gap between the organizations who were interested and willing to do things and the organizations who were actually taking action. And some of the reasons for that gap were a fear of failure. So organizations said that they had tried things and it hadn't worked and they weren't necessarily sure what had gone wrong, or they weren't confident that they had the skills and knowledge to implement gender equity initiatives successfully. So we wanted to offer a solution to sport organizations who wanted to embed gender equity into their organization, but they didn't necessarily know where to start. And we know that engaging with consultants can cost a lot, and so we wanted to ensure that we were creating something that is a free and accessible resource, so you can actually access the Same Game toolkit for free on our website. And Jenny is going to show us a little bit later what that toolkit looks like and how to use it. So the kind of intention behind the Same Game model is that we find that a lot of gender equity issues are addressed with more surface level, short-term actions and outcomes. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, we are really working for systemic change. So we want to make sure that those changes are, like I said, being embedded into the organization and kind of woven through all the decision making and everything that happens to make sure that it is something that's going to be sustainable and that's going to last longer than just the duration of a particular program or project. So what is Same Game actually? What is the model? You can see a picture of the model on the right-hand side of the screen, and really what this is it's a change management process that we've kind of put through the lens of gender equity, and we've added tools and resources and tips from the experiences of our 17 pilot organizations, which were local clubs, soccer and basketball clubs in Ontario, who went through this model with support from Canadian Women in Sport. So we've added those at every single step to help people kind of walk through this process that will ultimately help them embed gender equity into their organization. And one kind of other piece of context that I think is important is what we found when we first started the project, when we were doing the survey, is that people wanted to jump to step 6, which is to implement an initiative because they were excited or they had ideas and things like that, which is awesome. But what we found is that that was kind of where people were getting stuck because they were implementing, and if things weren't working, there wasn't really anything to fall back on. And it wasn't as strategic as it could be. So with this model, we've kind of walked it all the way back to step 1, which we think is to develop a vision around gender equity for your organization and what you want those initiatives to look like and what purpose they serve and how they're part of your overall organizational strategy. And then from there, we walk you through how to collect the data that you need to support that vision, how to plan for gender equity initiatives, how to communicate gender equity targets to your stakeholders so that people are aware of what's going on and so you're held accountable. And then from there, we go into how to build the capacity of people who will be implementing those initiatives, and then getting to step 6, which is to actually implement something, and then after that kind of reflecting and revising what we've done to make sure that we're learning from it. So there's a whole process there that is all part of the online tool. And as you can see kind of in the middle, we added creating buy-in as a really key focus throughout the whole entire process, because we found that if people were going through this without having the right kind of people and stakeholders involved, it wasn't as successful. So at every single step, we kind of address how to make sure that the people that you need to have on board are understanding why this is important and are an active part of the process. So we are going to watch a quick video that includes interviews from some of our pilot partners about why data collection was important to them when going through this process. And then after that, we're going to focus a little bit more on data collection as that step 2 concept.
use the same game data analysis tool to take a look at what our data was telling us as well. So surveys from players that were female players in our club, surveys that were from coaches that were females in our club, and then the data analysis tool actually shared with us that we should really be focusing on the coaching, and our direction was going to go towards the players. But we have about 50% of our athletes are girls, so we want to keep that momentum and keep supporting that initiative, but our focus had to be on, we need more women coaching because that's where our biggest discrepancy was.
The model, the way that it presented the data was super digestible. I loved it. It gave me like a great percentage point. It identified the kind of major gaps and the places where we were doing okay, but we probably needed to be mindful of.
Overall, we were able to use this data and kind of find out some key factors about like things we never really noticed before. So I think overall it was a really great findings and using them to our advantage.
Awesome. So we heard some things in there about what the impact of having data was on some of the organizations who went through this process, and Erin is going to share a little bit more, and you'll have an opportunity to ask her some questions as well. But just to kind of get us thinking a little bit more about data collection and kind of how you're doing that currently, we have our first poll that we're going to launch that we just invite everyone to respond to. So we're interested in knowing whether currently you collect and analyze gender data in your club, whether you collect gender data but you haven't analyzed it, or whether you're not collecting gender data in your club. So I will ask James to launch the poll if that makes sense, or I think I also have, I have the capability to do that, so I can do that for the next one. But you should see the poll on the screen. It's anonymous, so you can just select the option. Definitely no judgment or hard feelings here. We're hoping that we can walk away with some tools to be able to use data better use data. Okay, so I'm just sharing the results. So it seems like there isn't anyone on the call who says that they're currently collecting gender data or analyzing it, which is totally fine. And I think that's actually really great because we're going to have a chance to hear from Erin and hear what difference it made and to kind of brainstorm some strategies around how to do this. So hopefully you'll all walk away with a better kind of idea of what data can actually help you with and how to use it and how to collect it. So with that, we're going to move on to our second poll, which is just to ask you to select the statement that you feel applies to your club. So we want to know whether you consult with participants who are women and girls, if you consult with coaches and referees, if you consult with participants, coaches, and referees, or if you're currently not doing consultation with participants, coaches, or referees who are women and girls in your club. So I will launch poll 2. So you should see that on the screen now, and I'll just wait a second or two to see what we have to say. Just wait a little bit longer and see if there's anyone else who wants to jump in. Okay, awesome. So it looks like there's some of you who are consulting with participants and coaches and referees who are women and girls, which is awesome. And some of you who aren't, which is totally okay. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can do that and what the value of that is. So without further ado, I am going to pass the mic to Erin, who is the Director of Programs at the Oshawa Kicks Soccer Club, as she said. Erin participated in the Same Game pilot project in 2018, and she implemented the model in her club, and has definitely been instrumental in making the toolkit what it is today, along with our other partners. So we're really excited to have Erin join us today to be able to share her experiences and some of her learning. So Erin, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Such a nice introduction. Okay, so like Greer said, my name is Erin and I'm from Oshawa Kicks. What we did is our club applied for the Same Game grant back in 2018. And when we applied, we kind of had an idea of what we wanted to do in terms of executing. Like Greer said, we were already on step number 6. We already had that kind of tangible element in place that we wanted to achieve. But we really wanted to work through the entire model and see what other things we could learn and what our athletes maybe really needed instead of just running like a single day annual or non-annual event. We wanted something that was going to really impact the culture long term within the club. So I think we're gonna, thank you. Move on to slide 2. So I had some preconceived notions before we started because our club, we had already done a couple things in terms of gender equity. We already had gender specific programming and in our recreational and our competitive streams. So at the recreational level, a lot of soccer clubs are still doing like under 5 and under 6 and boys and girls play together. And what we were hearing from surveys responses over the years was that girls weren't as comfortable participating with boys, specifically as they got older. So we decided to take the proactive step in actually making gender specific programming in our recreational. And we also have that on the competitive side with male and female teams. Further to that, we do have some policies in place in terms of hiring for female coaches on the competitive side, in terms of like recruiting female coaches, because that talent is out there. And then once you have a female coach, retaining them and mentoring them the exact same way you would a male coach. And then I'll tell you about what our vision was. Our vision was to create this female leadership council. That was the end objective. It would run for 10 months out of the year and would match our programming style. And we were hoping that that kind of council would lead to better retention, creating a better culture, just leading to more overall engagement with all of the athletes within our competitive community. However, when we started working through the model, we started to collect data and things like that. And some of our visioning changed. So I think it's very important, and I'll probably say it a lot while I'm talking today, that listening to your data as you go through the model and always reflecting back on your original vision is going to be very important. Just because if you want to create something that's going to be impactful and going to create change, you actually have to identify the gaps and solve the gaps that are being presented in your data in order to make that change happen. So we just want to jump to the next one, Jenny. So Same Game does a really good job of creating these templates and frameworks for data collection. My job is about as far from data analysis and data collection as you could get in the sports world. I am a programmer, I'm an event planner. I don't collect a lot of data. I don't really know how to interpret a lot of data. I always joke with my boss because he's very into that. Every time he asks me to look at census data or survey feedback, I'm like, oh my gosh, my eyes kind of glaze over. So the Same model really, what it did is it created a way for me to collect it digest the information and be able to actually have something tangible come out of it. So the first one is the self-assessment. So this one is a little more opinion-based and kind of open-ended, and you as a stakeholder or any of your stakeholders within your club can fill it out, and it just kind of provided me with a baseline. So I had myself, our technical director, and our executive director, which is about 50% of the stakeholders within our club. We are quite small. We filled it out, and it gave me a good baseline as to what we as management and those overseeing the direction of the club kind of thought of ourselves and where we stood with gender equity. And then we took the data collection tool, which you heard a little bit about in the previous video. And it's a tool that allows you to take all your numbers. So our club has a database, essentially. We use something called viaSport, and it's an online platform where all our participant data is stored and archived. So each year when a player joins us, if they're new, they get a new profile, and if they're an existing player, their new content gets updated and added. So we're able to store a lot of data, but we hadn't actually been using that data in any sort of meaningful way since we signed with viaSport. So the data collection tool from Same Game really allowed us to extract the data that we already had on hand and see it in a new way that was easy to understand and that very distinctively broke up all of the gaps and allowed us just to see kind of where we stood in terms of our core data. So before I move on to the next slide, I just want to say that these two pieces really helped me in generating content and questions for what I thought was the most valuable data collection tool, which was actually the focus group. So if you have never run a focus group before, like me, Same Game provides you with a model and a structure in order to do so. So a focus group essentially just get a bunch of people together that you want to hear from. So we targeted a very specific group of people that we wanted to hear from based on the gaps that were identified through the two other data collection tools. So we wanted to talk to athletes in the competitive side that were female, that were U11 and older. We wanted to talk to their female managers, and we wanted to talk to their female coaches. So in total, we had 9 participants, and we asked them a whole bunch of open-ended questions, starting with their overall knowledge of gender equity, about how they viewed the club in terms of our ability to connect with them on various levels, how supported they felt by the club, and pretty much any other question I could come up with to try and get as much like qualitative data as possible. In my personal opinion, I would highly recommend running a focus group. I thought it was a really kind of straightforward way to interact with our community and get a really great amount of meaningful data back from them. I will say, and the consultant that was on with Same Game said to me over and over and over again, if you want a female to participate in your focus group, you're going to have to ask her. A bulk email to all teams did not yield any success. I did it and it was like crickets, and I had to actually personally email each person that I wanted to participate, and then I still had to kind of convince and twist some people's arms to actually get them into the physical room to participate. Once they were there, they did fantastic. Before that, it was a bit of a struggle. But that's just my 2 cents on a little bit of learning that we had on our end. So
That's really helpful, Erin. I was just gonna ask, like, how did you get those people in the room? How did you pick the people that you wanted to be part of that? But you got to my question before I did.
Shelley, who was on the team as well, was kind of instrumental in supporting me through the process. I had never run a focus group before, so I wasn't really prepared for the hurdles. And I'm sure it's written on every focus group document, like actually ask and actually connect with the people you want to have. So some of the really cool things that came out of the focus group was that our initial vision wasn't exactly what the girls within our club that we wanted to engage with. It's not really what they felt like they needed most. So our overall vision was to create this kind of really engaged and equal culture within the club. But what was missing was all the kind of foundational support within the club. So simple things like the uniform supplier only supplies unisex sizes, which is not a very supportive thing for the girls in the U11 up age group. Their bodies are changing, and having them in a men's size in a uniform that doesn't fit them well, that was important to them. So we've since, that was impactful change we were able to make. It was kind of been, once that was identified, it was kind of easy to solve. But we didn't know that was an issue. Other things like how the club presents itself on social media. We have a technical director who has a son who plays soccer. So when the technical director is out at the field, he snaps a picture of his son's team and it goes up on social media. But to all the girls in the club, what they see is boys wearing the Oshawa Kicks brand and not girls. And again, a simple fix, but not something that was kind of top of mind in the office. And we didn't see it as an issue before the focus group in terms of something that was kind of showing a lack of support to those women and girls. And then a few other topics came up, things like body image and peer pressure, confidence, injury prevention, all those kind of things. So what we decided after looking at the quantitative data and the qualitative data from the focus group, we might be able to flip forward a slide, sorry. Yeah, perfect. So just a quick quote. This is somebody that joined us in the focus group. She said this, she said, "I'd like to see the focus and mindset of the club shift towards the development of both girls and boys in the same capacity and to the same extent." So, things like the uniforms being gender specific, things like social media content and website content being equal to both genders, all those kinds of things were very important and was kind of the core narrative that came out of the focus group. So we as a club decided, after all of the data was collected and we did some planning and we looked back at our vision, we thought there needed to be some groundwork laid first before we tried to execute something as significant as a leadership council. So we decided, let's create a dashboard on our website that's 100% accessible, that has some of that content and support that our athletes are looking for, but also a form that they can fill out anonymously, ask the club questions on topics they're concerned about, and we can find the answers for them and provide them to them. Essentially, it gives them a way to connect with us and removes all the barriers that anyone would face. Like, I'm scared to ask my coach this question, or I'm not comfortable asking my teammate, so let's fill out an anonymous form, let's find the answer, let's feel supported. And we felt that was very important to kind of give everybody that base support before we went and just picked one person from each team to be that spokesperson leader on a council. And I think if we just flip to the last one there.
Sorry, Erin, I don't know if this is a good time, but we just had a question. James had a question in the chat. So he was wondering how you actually like amalgamated the data and the focus groups. Did you record it and like organize it by theme, or just take notes, or how did you kind of organize the data that you got from that part of the process?
Sure. So essentially, this was like pre-COVID, so we were all allowed to be in a room together, which was really great. And we just had a big wall, and each question that I asked had was written up there, and then I just went up with the marker, or had a participant come up with the marker and write their feelings, their voice down. And then we took that back and analyzed it against some of our quantitative stuff. I did record it as well, just for myself, so I could go back and listen to everything. I would maybe recommend having a note taker, just in addition to the recording, just so you can have somebody kind of facilitate the focus group, have a note taker, and then have everybody else just talking and engaged as best you can.
For sure.
I think that answers it. Okay.
Thanks, Erin. And I know that there's a worksheet in the model that's about focus groups and how to organize them, and I think it would go into kind of some tips like that. But thanks for elaborating.
I'm pretty sure I followed the worksheet probably to a T, and then I did email in my questions ahead of time because we were part of the pilot, just to make sure I was on base. I was very cautious about my questions to make sure that I wasn't leading anybody down a specific path. Like, I wanted to be very mindful that I wasn't just, I wanted a leadership council to happen. So I didn't want to guide the participants into creating that sort of almost fake narrative in the data collection. So then just to kind of wrap up, some of the challenges, strategies, and changes that we've had. So challenges, like I talked about already, is that we had a vision when we applied for the grant, but the data started to show us that maybe other layers needed to be added on top of that initial vision. So I think it's very important to always kind of reflect back to, I guess it's now step one, visioning, and see if your data actually fits within the vision, or what part of the vision might need to change or be adjusted as you continue to learn from your data. And then pushback, like change honestly doesn't happen without some sort of pushback somewhere along the way. So, I had pushback from my superiors, and the model does have various tools you can use to help you combat some of that pushback, whether it's providing you a template to showcase your data so you can present it in a way that's really impactful. I found that quite useful to kind of get us to pivot a little bit from our original vision. Strategies, like change doesn't happen overnight, so you have to be patient. We're almost a year finished from the pilot project, and we're still working on achieving the end goal. We're getting closer and closer. We do have a leadership council now established. It's just kind of COVID slowed us down a little bit, but it's not going to create this amazing culture in one cycle. It's going to take some significant time to build that, and to make it what we want and hope it will be. And then finally, change. And I know there's a reporting element in the model that helps you kind of wrap up your use of the toolkit. We haven't quite gotten there yet. We're still in the process of putting all the pieces together. So there is a way for you to measure your success and the amount of change you've been able to create at the end of this. Like for us, the one major victory we've had is we RFP'd for a new uniform supplier, and one of the components that was necessary in that request was that kits could be ordered in men's or women's. And I think if we wouldn't have made that a mandatory component of the RFP, I think we would have been letting the females down, and I think we would have lost any ground that we had gained in that supporting kind of mindset. So that's kind of my experience that we had at Oshawa Kicks with using the same game model, and how beneficial I found the data collection tool, as well as some of the other elements that are in the toolkit that you'll have the privilege of working through, which is fantastic. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. But.
Great. Thanks so much, Erin. I think we'll open the floor up to anyone that has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat function, and then Erin can answer some of those. And then also at the end, if you have any questions following this, we'll have some time to allow for that too.
I have a seemingly fairly simple one. You mentioned, you're still working towards your end goal, but then the goalposts have shifted. Can you define for us what your end goal of this is?
Yeah, so the end goal is to have girls U11 up be on this leadership council, learn various elements and pathways within the sport. So in my presentation, but I missed it, I think, is we had identified some other gaps. Like we had a lot of female recreational coaches, and we actually want to transition more boys into recreational coaching, and then do a better job of leveraging the girls that we have in our recreational side into getting them licensed and coaching on the competitive side. So the Leadership Council's objective at the end of the day is to create strong athletes that are engaged in the community and engaged within the club that continue to give back within the club. So the goal would have them be on the council U11 through U18, adding a new player each year so that council grows and grows, and then kind of a mentorship growth opportunity and funneling them into various avenues within the club, whether that's coaching, refereeing, administrating, or the athlete pathway. Does that make sense?
Great, thanks, Erin. We have another question here in the chat that says, specific to data collection, what data is collected? I'm assuming you mean quantitative data? So this is at the larger organizational level. How does this work at the club level?
Do they mean like what I specifically collected? Is that?
Yeah, maybe if you can speak to what specific numbers you had collected in terms of your quantitative information, like you mentioned with your database, but in terms of coaches, maybe what's information there. And then I read now, it's two different questions. So the second question being, this is the larger organizational organizational level? How does it work at the club level? Maybe you can clarify that, because so Erin, is all of this that is now being described is at the club level. But Erin, maybe you can, if you can address that first question in this instance.
Sure. For the data that we collected, we essentially looked at our registration data, our participant data. So date of birth, gender, like how long they had been with the club. The data collection tool in Same Game essentially takes those numbers. So we identified the U11 to 14 female age group, for example, as a gap. So we had 39% female participation in that age group. And then the tool actually provides you with some language around what that means in terms of kind of industry standards within sports and recreation overall. So then we did the same thing with athlete participation as we did with coaches participation. So we took all of our coaching staff, competitive wise. We have approximately, I think it's like 85% male coaching in the competitive stream. And then in the recreational stream, we're about 90% female coaches, which is kind of a huge contrast. So that gap that's identified between the competitive and the female side, the competitive and the recreational side, is easily solved by retaining those recreational coaches and mentoring them to move into the competitive stream. So it looks like a glaring gap, but it's easily kind of solved.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Yeah, I think that's really great. And given that coaching was a part of your, and leadership was a part of your vision in the beginning, I think it makes sense that that's the information you've collected. To address that second question, I'm not sure if we're fully understanding that question, but in terms of, if you're asking in terms of scaling the amount of data or the types of data you're collecting, I think in the tool, it will give you an opportunity, which I'll talk to and I'll walk through in a second, but it will give you an opportunity to reflect on what types of data you can collect to have the greatest impact, or what do you want to learn about your organization to determine and focus on a few data points. So it's not saying that you need to go out and collect a bunch of information and put in, resources and investment into it. But a lot of times it's leveraging some of the existing systems, like your registration system, processes. Maybe if you do evaluation, that's also a really good point to collect some of that quantitative data, as well as being able to compare it to their experiences through their feedback in the evaluation. Roberta, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to elaborate on that question a little more?
Yes, I'm a little confused in terms of the whole process. I guess I'm not understanding correctly. Same Game is, I thought it was about larger organizations. I'm a coach at a rowing club, and so I thought it was more at the Rowing BC level than at my club level, which is a very small club, and identifying, like I was confused about how specific this program is to my club level, and my inequality is I have more females than males. So I guess I'm not sure how this will all fit with what I would be looking at.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this tool is is designed and developed with clubs, and I would say it predominantly targets clubs, although a lot of it is introducing a process and resources for an organization to embed gender equity. So it doesn't, I would say that it applies to organizations of all sizes, and I think you'll find that it would be really relevant in the club structure, as Erin has mentioned. In terms of gender equity, when you have more women than men, I think a lot of the questions and things in there can apply to any sort of targeted group that you want to work with. So whilst because our organization is Canadian Women in Sport, so a lot of our expertise and research and resources are going to be focused around, I guess, balancing or tipping the weight a little bit towards having more women or having more women to correct some historical imbalances in the sports sector. But you'll find that a lot of the principles and tools and processes that are introduced through the Same Game online toolkit is going to be applicable if you're, let's say you're wanting to have more boys. So it's about consulting with boys. If you want to, if you already have a lot of women and girls in your sport, but you want to diversify and have a more diverse candidate pool for your coaches, have more diverse participants and athletes, for example, then you can apply that to the specific targeted groups that you want to work at reaching out to. So I think what I'll do now is maybe go through the tool to show you, to give you a little bit of a vision or a visual representation of what the tool looks like, and then we'll allow for some time at the end if some of those questions still exist. But before I move on, maybe we'll just pause for one last second if anyone has any questions specific to what Erin has shared on her organization. Okay, great, let's move on. Okay, so following the pilot project that we implemented with Erin as well as our other partners, we also conducted an evaluation in partnership with Brock University. So Dr. Shannon Kerwin interviewed the participants and gleaned a lot of learnings from their experience in implementing Same Game. And that helped us create this online toolkit, which is essentially an online platform that walks users through this process of creating a solid foundation and then increasing your organization's preparedness to implement gender equity work and set you up for success. So this is the home screen here that you see on the screen, and it essentially translates the rich information and research and resources that we've found through this process. So Erin talked about the length of time that it's taken to implement Same Game, and we know that with any types of systemic and cultural change, it takes time. And whilst we have it set up in a nice circular motion or a straight line across, as you'll see in the online toolkit, it isn't always linear. So you might start with step 1, step 2, step 3, you might find something else, you might go back to step 2 into data collection. So the key here is being patient, one, and it's also ensuring that you're collaborating. So in a lot of gender equity, diversity, or inclusion work, it tends to land on the shoulders of someone within the club that is really passionate or that is really wanting to champion this cause. But for it to be an effort that is sustainable and for it to be embedded into your culture, it's always best to have it as a collaborative effort as a team. So once you've accessed the toolkit too, you can bookmark the page. And so when you're using the same browser and the same browser and the same device, when you leave the toolkit and come back, it will take you back to the spot where you've left off. So it's designed so that you would get started, you would be prompted to implement an activity, you go away to implement that activity, and you'll be able to come back and carry on with the toolkit. So the toolkit, when you click start, it opens with an introductory section, which covers things like theoretical information, the types of research that this tool is based on, definitions. So what's the difference between equity and equality, for example? A lot of some countries and organizations say gender equality, and we use gender equity. So it explains things like that. It explains things like diversity and inclusion. What does that mean? Before getting into the model itself. So since we're focusing on data collection today, I'm going to walk you through some of the pages in that section specifically to give you a sense of what the experience will be like and what types of resources will be included. Erin's already mentioned some of them, so I'll give you a bit of a demonstration, I guess, of what those look like. So at the top of the screen here, so this is what it looks like, one of the overview pages, and every step starts with this overview page. It introduces in a snapshot or in one screen what the step entails, why it's important, what you're going to do, so how are you going to implement the step, what preparation is involved with implementing the step, a timeline. So that's a really helpful tool for you to look at and have an expectation of how long it's going to take or how much of a time commitment it's going to be. And then buy-in right at the bottom there where it talks about what are the potential pushbacks and anticipating those so that you can put strategies in place. I was going to say too that at the top of the screen here, you can see where in the same game model you are. So right now we're in the collect data, and then the second column here talks about all the different aspects, and then we'll go through those in a second too within that step itself. So right at the beginning, we invite you to start to reflect on what you want to learn through the data collection process, whether it's quantitative data, like how many women and newcomer women and girls participating in the sport, or qualitative data, like what are the experiences of coaches in the sport, and how does it differ between men and women, for example, or people who are visible minorities versus people who are not. So reflecting on things like that will and making sure that you have that reflection early on allows you to really focus your efforts on what will have the most impact and what will be the most efficient going forward. So this is where refers to what I spoke about earlier around thinking about the scale. So what is feasible? What do you have the capacity to collect? This is the time to do all of that thinking. So once you've entered your information in this box, you can have a look at when you click submit, some resources and information and guidance pops up to guide you through the next step of that. So Erin spoke about the self-assessment tool. So often when we think about gender equity or women and girls, you tend to think about participation. That is sort of the first thing you jump to, or even coaches, some of the outward facing stuff. But what we found through our experience in working with a number of sport organizations, whether it's at the club or the provincial or the national level, is that numbers are a symptom of systemic inequities. So when you see the numbers as it's reflected in your participation number, when we do more digging and we conduct gender equity assessments in depth with these organizations, it always leads back to the organization or how the sport is structured. Things like how your programs are designed, the types of language that you use in your job description, for example, whether you have adequate policies around gender equity, diversity, and access. Who are the leaders and who are the role models in the sport? So all things that are within the control of the organization that shows up as inequities in numbers. So this section here provides you with this tool here, the Gender Equity Self-Assessment tool. And it's designed for clubs and provincial and territorial sports organizations to start looking at your organization with a gender and diversity lens. So this will help you start to be aware of some of the things that are within your control as an organization, identify gaps and inequities that you can address internally before looking externally. So here it invites you to download that tool and complete that. I missed a step here, but in between each major activity, we have a reflection step where we ask questions to prompt you to think about, okay, now that you've collected this information, how can you make sense of it before you move on to the next step? Because I think a lot of organizations collect a bunch of data if they do, but it tends to sit there or it sits in a database without any sort of analysis that follows. So this tool itself walks you through that process. This is the step where we then invite you to collect if you don't currently collect it, but also gather the data into this tool. So this is a gender data collection tool that Erin mentioned and was mentioned in the video as well. And I think I'm going to show you what it looks like here. Hopefully you can see the form now on the screen. So this is essentially a really simple form for you to punch in your numbers. So if you know how many athletes you have that are male or female, non-binary or unknown, or not applicable, you may not serve a certain age group, for example. And it covers things like athletes at different age groups, coaches, recreational, coaches, competitive, officials and referees, board members, paid staff members, and then whether or not you engage with vulnerable girls and women as athletes or in various capacities. So it's yes, no, and unsure for different underrepresented groups here. And then when you click analyze results, and you can take your time to insert this information, what this tool helps as well is for you to identify information that you don't have. Then it's going to prompt you to figure out system or ways to collect that information. And then what it spits out is the percentage point that Erin was speaking about earlier. So it gives you a really clear gender breakdown of participants and leaders at different levels. And in addition to just calculating the percentage for you based on your numbers, we also provide things like current data on participation by gender. It also gives you research around why it's important to develop or to have gender equity at certain age groups. And that applies for every question here. So you'll see some guidance in terms of how you can advance equity at those levels. So this is a really useful tool, not just for you to make sense of your data and to collect it, but also a really powerful communication tool. So as you look at, creating buy-in, which we spoke about when you look at trying to communicate the fact that this is the reason for change and the why, this is a really good tool for you to be able to do that, because you can download it, you can print it, you can present it in various different ways. So that's the screenshot of it, which we don't need anymore. And then we go into focus groups and community consultations. So in addition to quantitative data, also really important to collect qualitative data so that you can better understand lived experience, barriers and needs. So the numbers tell you where the gaps are, who is and isn't participating, but it doesn't tell you why. So pairing that the numbers with experiences is really important for you to then be able to turn it into a feedback loop to identify, okay, this is what exactly we need to do. This is the strategy that needs to happen. And like Erin mentioned from her experience, it might be different to what your assumptions were. And so it's really important then to ask specific questions. And I won't go into the importance of that because Erin's already covered it, but just to show you that we have information about how you can go about organizing a focus group. It's all the pointers that Shally, who we spoke about earlier, our consultant, that has shared from her experience of doing these. So it's things like you need to be actively approaching women and girls if you want them to come to your focus groups. So tips and tricks like that is included in these resources, but also facilitator guides and sample questions. So like Erin said, you don't want to have really closed-ended questions that sort of push people into a corner. You want it to be sufficiently open-ended so that you get honest responses. So there's questions there that will provide you with some examples. And then there are sample focus group invitations as well. So you don't even need to write the invitation. You just copy and paste from the Word document. So lots of useful and practical information like that you can access through this. You can also see Erin here starring in this video, just to say that there are many videos like that throughout from interviews with our pilot organization. So you'll also be able to hear from experiences as you go through the toolkit. So initially what we were going to do is we were going to put everyone in breakout rooms and have a discussion, but I think we have a small enough and intimate enough group that we can maybe, if you are comfortable unmuting yourself and then having a discussion here, I think it will be really interesting to hear from everyone in terms of what you think are some of the inequities or gaps that you've identified. Like Roberta shared with us that actually in rowing, you have more girls and you have more women leaders, you have more female board members at the national level, for example. So any observations around gender diversity, if you have women and girls already, what does the diversity look like in terms of the profile there? And for the other clubs, whether you currently collect data or sort of what are some of the assumptions around inequity that you'd like to verify through data? So maybe if we, I'll maybe open the floor just to see if anyone has any immediate thoughts to share. Some of the questions we have here are things like, what data do you already have that you can leverage when it comes to gender and diversity? What data do you wish you had and why? And then what are the challenges of data collection? There are many. Capacity is one that we hear over and over again, but what are some of the other things that you've heard or that you've experienced from your role and your context? So Roberta, I see that you had unmuted yourself for a little bit, so maybe I'll pick on you to begin with. And then maybe we'll go to Jerry or Katie after that.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I was talking very specifically about our club, which is a very small club, and I think one of the reasons that I have more females than males is because I'm a female coach, and that's my own instinct on it. So I could be totally wrong on it, but yeah. And so at the national level, provincial level, I really couldn't say that there's more females than males, because rowing has been a male-dominated sport for a long time.
Right. Yeah, and we have worked with Rowing Canada quite recently, actually, and they share a very similar. They share similar comments. So they have more at certain levels. They have more women coaches, and they do have more women board members than men. But they did share that at the high performance level, at the highest level of coaching for rowing, there are definitely more men. And so that was a really interesting conversation where you see that, okay, in a lot of areas in the sport, it's there are a lot of women and girls participating, but at the highest level of coaching, I think they have 2 women, and the rest of the national level coaches are men. So really interesting to dive into that, and that came about through data, and then the next step would be to ask some questions. Yeah, really interesting.
In terms of the questions that you've asked, what data do you already have and that you can leverage? Because this is the first time I'm going through this process, the only data that I would be able to access is through Rowing Canada, our registration, and and how many people are with our club and that sort of thing. And I guess I'd like to, what data do you wish you had and why? And you've given some data that's more specific to outside of my own small place here, so that's helpful. And the challenges of data collection in our club, I guess there wouldn't be the challenge in that I feel like I could go and do like a focus group and such as that. So I'd also like to look at it from not from my club level, but from my community level, as in the larger community that I live in, and how we can, as a community, increase gender equity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and something that I always advise organizations too is look at your population. So if you're in a local community and census data and things like that, it gives you a breakdown, at least based on a few key groups like women. So you definitely get a gender breakdown. You get information on people who identify as invisible minority. Sometimes you get information about persons with disability and Indigenous populations. So already there you have 4 really useful data points on your community that you can then compare to the data points of the same population within your club. If there is a gap or a discrepancy between, like, for example, if your community is 6% Indigenous, but you have no Indigenous athletes within your club, then that shows a gap. 6% isn't a big gap, but in terms of there being somewhat of a significant Indigenous population, it's worth exploring, what are we doing or what are we not doing to engage with the Indigenous population, just as an example. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point to look at not just who is in your club, but who could be in your club that isn't. Lorianne, would you like to share your thoughts on those questions or anything else?
Sure. So I am a physical therapist with a special interest in sport development and would like to become more involved in the community. And I'm also a national athlete in ski mountaineering, and I'm involved in the organizational structure of that and getting more involved. And so for data that we have for ski mountaineering, I would say we only really have our registration of kind of male, female for our divisions. It's something that we're trying to grow the sport of ski mountaineering in Canada and trying to figure out how we can set up these policies now as a growing organization to include gender equity and include diversity within the training for our staff with our coaches and our organizational committees. So yeah, at this point I've only had male coaches and haven't had any female specific aspects to any of my training. And so I think that'd be really important moving forward, and looking forward to try to incorporate some of this within the creation of the structure of the organization from the start.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Sometimes when you have things up and running, you have really rigid systems already in place, and it's really hard to sort of come in at that midpoint to say, okay, now we're going to collect a bunch of data. But then if it's something that is quite new, then it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, we want to make sure we have the foundation set for it. You mentioned a policy. I think that's a really good place to start, because it lays down sort of principles and a foundation for how you're going to approach things like programming, things like events, things like coaching, leadership, etc. And then using that almost as your gender equity vision to say, okay, so now we're going to start working through some of these key pieces. We're going to collect data, and then we're going to plan, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I like the specificity and like trying to specific tasks. I feel like as the only female on the board right now, I will bring in that I would like more gender equity, and that's really important. And people will just come back with a, oh yeah, no, we want to be diverse, and but yeah, equal is great. But there's not a lot of that like specific action goal and making it that we're purposely trying to do this. So
yeah. And it's always like, okay, Lorianne, you go and do that. You figure it out. And you tell us, we've heard that one a lot. Greer, go ahead.
Sorry, I think specifically too, like as you mentioned, if you're trying to grow your sport, I think that is a unique opportunity, kind of like Jenny was mentioning earlier, to like think outside the box about who isn't participating and how you can build things specifically for and with those people to encourage them to come in and gain something from the sport. So that's something that I've also heard a lot in terms of like handling that type of pushback that sometimes happens, is that like if we are super interested in growing, like let's look at those places where we might not be doing so well and be a bit more innovative about how we could approach those too.
Thanks, Greer. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but just want to make space if Jerry or Katie, if you have anything to share, you'd like to or have any questions. Katie?
Yeah, thanks. Just while I have the floor, I'll say thanks to all who put this on. This has been really helpful for me. I'm the program director for an alpine ski club, and we have data in the form of registration numbers from the last few years. We're, I'd say, doing okay on a lot of fronts, but we have a pretty big gap gender-wise in our entry-level age groups at the moment. So the data I really wish I had was actually data from outside of organization and from the community, because I think a lot of young girls are being drawn to stuff. And I did actually a focus group around a year ago and found out from that a lot of the girls in my club peers are getting, like, they're not getting involved in skiing because of other sports like gymnastics and dance and skating and stuff. So what would be really valuable to me would be, I think, data from outside my organization and just from the broader community about what we could do basically to get more girls getting, joining at that entry level. Challenges. I guess that's all I would say on that for now.
I think that's really interesting, especially with Alpine, and we've been doing some work with Alpine Canada as well, where they raise a similar issue in terms of that there's a preconceived notion about alpine skiing as a sport, that it tends to seem like it's elite or that it's expensive. There's sort of a higher bar of entry, and so and
it's fast and dangerous, and a lot of sports are, but I think that is a bit of a turnoff for some families for sure.
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to these are all assumptions, right? And sort of a sense that you get. So it'll be interesting to have opportunities. I know when I used to do this sort of work in New Zealand, we would go to a lot of community events, or we would have, we had a bunch of festivals where we were, like, there was a big Chinese community, so there was always Chinese related festivals going on, and some clubs would like to target the Chinese community, and so they would go to these events and have little games or little have a go sessions to create sort of a festive feeling, but then take that opportunity to speak to the people within that community. So leveraging on some of the community-based activities or places where there is a captive audience to see how you can find some synergies there, and then using those opportunities as data gathering sessions, I guess, informal focus groups. And then that way, you start to get a bit more of a confirmation on some of these assumptions. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for those ideas.
Yeah, no problem. Jerry, I don't want to leave you as the last person who hasn't shared anything, but if you, sorry, James.
Sure. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say to Katie, and relevant to the call, I do have access to the viaSport provincial-based databases. So if you're registered with your provincial sport organization, I can provide that macro level data community by community. And I've got an intern really crunching the numbers throughout the region, and I can add that to her list, and then we can connect offline about what that community-wide picture looks like for the sports sector in your region. So at least help that conversation.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be amazing. Thanks.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Jerry, did you have anything you'd like to share?
I just wanted to say this has been very interesting. I appreciate being able to participate in this. I'm a sensei with Karate Canada and Karate BC, and we will be putting a team in the Olympic Games for Canada coming up in Tokyo. Karate BC is very strong in karate, and we have a huge population of female participants. Great. And in my background, I have trained over the years many female participants that have done very well in competition, BC Winter Games and provincial level competition here in the province, and in Alberta before that. Anyway, I'm interested in looking at opportunity or ways of improving their experience, because I want to start training athletes again in the Kootenay district, and I'm looking to bring that zone up for BC because it's basically gone flat. So what I want to do is try to get women and girls participating in karate competition, traditional karate competition. They don't have to compete. Participation at the dojo level is fine, and they can still be graded and progress with the sport and learn the advantages and also the kobudo that goes with it. It's a wonderful art form, and there's a lot of women and girls competing in karate across Canada with great success. And I'm looking to start training students again in the Kootenay district, because it's basically gone flat in that area, yet the rest of the province is booming. And hardly any students from the Kootenays go to the Winter Games now, which is very disappointing.
Yeah, I wonder if you have any insights or any speculation as to why that might be.
There was a general lack of interest, kind of fell off over the years. I don't know why. The Karate BC is nonprofit. I'm nonprofit, and I think what happened was Taekwondo beat karate to the Olympic Games, and historically they took a lot of the interest out of karate. But the karate competition is really strong and worldwide, and always has been. And Karate Canada is a huge organization, and Karate BC sends all kinds of students to the nationals now. I was a national level competitor for many years. And I want to be able to take my experience and training skills as a coach and train women to come up. And I have a couple of ladies in the Kootenay district I've talked to who are more advanced that are looking to take a role. And I'd like to bring them forward and train them to take over for me and keep the ladies and girls going ahead in the Kootenays. But because of this incentive brought forward by Columbia Basin Trust and the viaSport for women and girls in sport, I've decided to take that on as a challenge and just look to get some assets together so I can advertise, get a website going, and start a registration from Nelson and Castlegar in that district in BC to try to get a registration where I could start to train some ladies and girls in sports from scratch. So I'm looking to start from fresh here. It's not like it's going on now. I'm looking to do it starting in May.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Jerry. That's really great and really excited. You're getting me motivated to see what you're going to do. So I think that's really amazing. And I think a really interesting data point that we also recommend, in some organizations where you are seeing drop off, whether it's as participants or as coaches or as staff, if you have high turnover within your organization, is to do, whether it's formal or informal, exit interviews. When people have left the sport or left your organization as a staff, for example, they're a lot more forthcoming with feedback, and you get a lot more honest insights and comments around their experiences. So I think that's a really valuable data point or insight that you can gather. Sometimes it is just a phone call to people, but if you have the information on your database, reaching out directly and say, hey, we want to better understand. We're trying to grow our participation. We've noticed that you've left. Can you give us some insight as to why? And share a bit of your experience. Again, going back to Erin's point of shoulder tapping and directly reaching out for feedback, that's going to, I think, give you some really clear insights, and it's going to help you focus your efforts in terms of, okay, what do I have to change so that it's going to work this time? Or what mistakes could we have unintentionally made in, or not you specifically, but maybe the region or the organization prior to you, that we don't want to repeat in this next round. So I think those exit interviews is going to give you some really great insights there. I'm mindful of time, so I just want to go through the last bit of my presentation here. So Greer's already shown you this. So when we talked about collecting data, it's step 2. We added step 1 vision as a direct result of feedback from Erin and our other partners, and the evaluation with Dr. Kerwin at Brock University as a really essential step that needs to be established, but also needs to be revisited as we go. Collecting data is step 2, and then it leads you through the process for planning, whether it's initiatives, programs, or events, setting and communicating your targets, so knowing what you want to achieve, and then establishing a system of tracking and measuring whether or not you've been successful, and then communicating those targets to keep your organization or your club accountable to them. Building capacity. So this is a big step. There are 2 rows of aspects in there, because it talks about onboarding people onto your process. It talks about not doing this on your own. So what information or what training do you need to provide to people around you, whether it's parents that are interested, volunteers, coaches, board members, so that you're bringing people along on this journey with you. And then step 6 is actually trying something. And then step 7, reflecting and revise. So putting in place evaluation so that, again, you're not making the same mistakes, and you're carrying on all the great things that worked well in this process. And then you'll see creating buy-in as a big centerpiece in this, because if you don't have buy-in, you're not going to be successful. It's really important all along the way that you are communicating. Data is a big piece of that communication. I wanted to go through it here. So we have some resources here that will help you share that data. And we put that in there because we know that for people who are not naturally passionate about gender equity or diversity, it's really important to present evidence-based rationale. I think there's a lot of times we have assumption-based rationale, or we think this is what went wrong, so we're going to do this. But when you have hard data and you have quotes from women within and or outside of your club, then it's going to be a really compelling case to create buy-in along the way, especially with leaders and board members and things like that. The other critical success factor in embedding gender equity too is the power of interaction, or having a community of practice. One of the feedback that we got from our pilot organizations as well is that sometimes it's really hard when you're going at this on your own. Lorianne, you mentioned you're the only woman on the board at the moment, and that's the case for a lot of boards. So I think it's really important to, I think you have a great community here already in this network, so utilize platforms like this to share information, to find your sounding board, and to share resources, and it allows you an opportunity to be innovative and creative in this process as well. And in terms of creating buy-in and overcoming pushback, we have this section here in every step, sometimes twice, because we know that pushback is going to pop up. we know that there will be resistance. Like Erin said, any change will have resistance. There will be roadblocks, there will be challenges. So we invite you to reflect on those and preempt them here before you reach out. And then think about how you're going to deal with it. And I mean, we hear a lot of different pushback, but a lot of it is the same. We've heard it over and over again. So we've saved them in a few documents that you can access through this toolkit as well, in terms of different strategies or different things you can do to overcome those, or to respond to these pushbacks that you will come across in your journey. So if you are interested in looking at Same Game, and you may have questions that come up once you've had a chance to access it and implement it as you go, but you can access it here. So it's on our website, womeninsport.ca/Same Game. We'll send you an email with the link to that as well, so you can go in there. Just make sure that once you've accessed the tool, to bookmark the page so that you can, like I said, leave and then come back, and then it will save your progress there. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to email us, and then we'll get back to you with some specific questions there. Just for the last 4 minutes that we have, it will be really great if you can scan this QR code here to access our evaluation form, just so that we can collect some data and make sure that, you know, we're learning from your experience through these workshops and presentations, and so that we can make them better. So I think everyone's familiar with QR codes now in COVID days. So just opening up your smartphone camera, scanning the code, and then it should give you a link to prompt you to fill out that evaluation form. So thank you again for being here with us today. Greer, I don't know if you wanted to say something before we hand it back over to James and Mike.
No, I was just going to say that I also put the link to the evaluation in the chat, and you can select a custom session when it asks you which presentation you attended, and we'll send the link in the follow-up email as well. So lots of ways to access the evaluation.
We really want you to fill it out, you can tell. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, the three of you, for sharing with us today. I thought that was awesome. I'm sorry that the crowd was so thin, but I'm sure everyone on here took a lot from it. And we'll encourage the rest of the collaborative to watch online and potentially bring you back. Erin, I really appreciate the tangible lived experience side of things, and that was just a really great addition, Jenny and Greer, so thanks for including her. Yeah, this was super awesome. Thank you very much to the four of you for showing up and being a part of this community. Don't forget to sign up for the one in January. So Dr. Shauna Taylor presenting on stopping eating disorders in their tracks. So a proactive approach to disordered eating in sport. It should be super awesome. And yeah, thank you all very, very much. Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll do a plug for a couple of Basin Plays things. I wanted to let people who are on the call know that this is our last month of intake for the Basin Plays training grants. So if there's training that you know is coming up that you would like some funding for your coaches, for youth sport, you can apply to either host training for up to $2,500 or send a coach to training for $1,000. I know that this is difficult to send people anywhere at this time. If there's something that you know is happening though, that is available. And as well, I think most of you have been on the basinplays.org website that we're calling the Hub. We're hoping it's the one-stop shop for all sport and physical literacy for youth in the Columbia Basin. So if you haven't been there, we encourage you to go there and create a presence for your sport organization. If you have any questions about the Hub, you can contact me at basinplays@ourtrust.org, and we could set up a time, and I'd be happy to do a Zoom call and walk you through it. I think that's it for me.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy your evenings.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye.